welcome back to the Women in STEM podcast featuring women in computing or women in computer science. And today is a fantastic topic. We're going to be talking about geeks. I can't wait. My inner geek is screaming for joy. I'm thinking that this is going to be a lot of fun because when I think about geeks, there's so much we can think about stereotypically, but I'm sure that you've got something to tell us about it when we talk about women and women in computer science. So, Jennifer, can you take it away?
Thank you, Crystal. Yeah, so geeks are really interesting. I know that most of us sort of identify with that inner geek, and I definitely have one as well. But I kind of want to go back and take a look at that history of what it means to be a geek. And I'm going to take you all the way back again to the 1950s. Surprisingly, when I was researching the origin of the word geek, I also found the word nerd. And I don't want to get into that debate because I know there's a really hot debate over geek and nerd, and they're often used interchangeably. And that's a whole nother podcast, I'm sure, as a discussion on the differences and the similarities between geek and nerd. But the term nerd is first seen in the 1950s in a Dr. Seuss book.
You're
I think it
kidding.
was called If I Ran the Zoo. And it has absolutely nothing to do with what we think of as a nerd. I think it was just a made up word, another Dr. Seuss word that he had made up. And it talks about one of his animals in this zoo. Again, it has nothing to do with what we think of of the term nerd. But we start seeing that geek in the 1950s. And when I think of a geek, I think of somebody who has glasses and hair slicked back, pocket protector, wearing black and white with pants that are too short, and it's a very male figure. And that's something that carries on to today. We see that in especially again the 1980s, 1990s when we look at Hackers, Revenge of the Nerds, and that's when computers start to become very popular. It's something we start using in universities and businesses and even in our own homes. And that geek, sort of the pocket protector against, sexually frustrated man, we start to see him in popular culture as well as in related strongly to computers and computer science.
That's a very interesting point because it relates to the larger stereotypical situation around STEM in general. Because you think about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the scientist. You used to have a problem when you Googled scientist, all the pictures would come up male, largely wearing lab coats, usually crazy hair going off in all different directions, and very strange things in beakers. And that was the scientist and the image that was always broadcast back. And when you looked at engineer, well, it's a term that not too many people were very familiar with, except of thinking about trains and engineer conductors and these kinds of things. But it was male. It was always male. And that's something that has created barriers where there weren't even physical barriers. So this idea that it's impacting computers too, and it's this image because the movies Revenge of the Nerds and Nerds, like those are huge. They take up such a big part of the idea that we have around computing. So when we're looking at this and the words, the once again we're talking about how words play such a key aspect. So how do we get around this stereotype? How did women get around this stereotype, and how did they deal with nerds, geeks, however we want to call them, so that they could actually own that area?
Yeah, it's very complicated. And I'm glad you brought up other stereotypes from other aspects of STEM. And, I often go back to Doc from Back to the Future. And I love Doc. Everybody loves Doc, but he is very the epitome of the stereotypical mad scientist. And
Indeed.
it's not always necessarily the words that we're very worried about. What we're also worried about is the sort of unconscious bias that we have especially in computer science. There was a study that was done in the US. I think it was Carnegie Mellon University. So, very famous place for computer science. The study looked at unconscious bias and stereotypes that perhaps we don't even realize are happening. So at the university, they asked students to write a test, and I think it was a test that had nothing to do with computer science, but they were just asking them to come in and write a test. And in the first one, they had a room that was full of sort of geek and nerd stereotypical things, such as Star Trek posters and Star Wars posters. And they asked them to write the test in the room, and it was both men and women. And then they wrote the test and left. And then they had a second group of people come in and they changed everything in the room, very neutral things. They put in posters of plants and rocks and very neutral items in the room. And they asked both women and men to write the test, and then they left. And then when they did the debrief afterwards in the stereotypical room with the Star Wars posters, when they asked women and men how they felt, the women very much noticed the room, and they said, yeah, we felt really awkward writing in that room, and we felt like it was a really geeky kind of room, one where we didn't really feel accepted. And I believe that they actually did worse on the test in that room. And the men were like, oh yeah, that room was really cool, it was really neat, oh, I love Star Wars. And in the more neutral room, the women and the men were both very neutral, and they did better on the test. So we don't even realize that these things have an effect on the way that we function and the way that we work, especially in university settings where those stereotypes are very strong and remain very strong to today.
Yeah, definitely the subconscious level. This is something that we really have to watch when we're looking at, is there some kind of bias there that's having an effect on those people who are there, and what is it doing? And asking these questions is so important. Now, when we look at the organizations around computing, how do those play into this situation? Because you get, I think if we, from our previous discussions, we talked about how organizations formed and how did that impact women?
Women and men have both really embraced the geeks. It's not something that's been like, a lot of people will argue that the geek culture has been embraced by women today, and women are saying, hey, we're girl geeks, we're girl nerds. And that first, and we look at like Big Bang Theory, and all the women on there except for Penny, but the other two girlfriends there are very much accepting of that geek and nerd stereotype. Very, very brilliant. And again, we see that girl nerd stereotype in the 1960s. It's the girl geek, and has wears large clothing, has sort of like they call her in one of the newspaper articles in the Globe and Mail that she's wearing like a potato sack, and she has to ask her mother for permission. So very submissive kind of personality.
Okay.
And that's something that we see in the 1960s, but again, very related to the male nerd. Her boyfriend was the male nerd. Well, and sometimes not even boyfriend. They don't really sort of get together because they're very wrapped up in computers and not really necessarily interested in each other. And that sort of brings me to the point I wanted to quickly address is the computing labs. So the computing labs was something that we really see as being detrimental. Women were not comfortable in these labs. They were large spaces filled with computers, and geeks and nerds would stay up all night coding in these computer labs. And it was not a welcoming space for women. The men would eat from vending machines, and they would just really neglect their appearances. And it's not really a stereotype that's very welcoming to women in the computer labs. And then when the computers go home into the homes, it's something that, women still don't use as much. It's very functional as opposed to let's see how we can break it and make it work again.
Okay, so we see a lot of different situations evolving there, and at this point, we've done two podcasts together, and we've talked more at the macro level of how things are operating. But the next podcast coming up, we're going to get a little bit more specific by looking at two computer scientists, Charlotte and Beatrice. So, looking really forward to where we're going to go there. And we'll be with you again on podcast number 3. Thank you very much.